Okay, folks, this is just a test, and let's see if the microphone improves the audio a little bit. We're looking at this poem, Outside History by Eavan Bolands. So, let's go through it. She begins with the line, "There are outsiders always." Of course, this refers to the entire breadth of history. There are marginalized and forgotten people throughout history. And in the first line, Boland identifies the subject matter of her thesis. These stars, she quickly change, and we assume outsiders are people, but she quickly changes to her metaphorical representation of the outsiders, the stars, these iron inklings of an Irish January. Now, the use of repetitive sibilance here is to really emphasize the stark distance of not just the stars, but of course, metaphorically, what they represent, which is the suffering of people who are long dead. And their suffering, like the light of the stars, has had to wait a long time to reach the reader and to reach Boland, whose light happened thousands of years before our pain did. So now she's becoming more explicit, and she's tying up the two representations together. The light of the stars, like the pain and suffering of people in the past, takes time to reach the current generation. It takes time for them to become aware of it, and it takes time indeed for the current generation to begin to empathize emotionally with the suffering of people in the past. They have always been outside history. And of course, she's zeroing in here on what this poem represents. It isn't just about the famed people, the Padraig Pearses, the Brian Boru's, or even in global history. They're well remembered, they're well recorded, but what of all the people who died, the millions who died, and nobody remembers their name? So she's referring to not the mythological or prominent people of history, the ordinary people, the men, women, and children whose lives were cut short by cruelty, by war, by indifference, and even a literary indifference. Nobody wrote any great epilogues or, sorry, the word I'm looking for, nobody wrote any great laments for them at this time. Most of them individually, personally, were forgotten without a trace. So she's referring to those who are outside history, who have not been recorded by history. They keep their distance. Now, the stars keep their distance. They are distant objects. But the pain and suffering of the outsiders is something that has kept its distance from the present generation and for generations who came afterwards. Under them remains a place where you found you were human. Under them means under the stars, but it also represents and can mean under them, having come after those generations of people who died forgotten. Remains a place where you found you were human, and a landscape in which you know you are mortal. Very direct, explicit speech here. And she's contrasting the brevity or shortness of human life with that of the longevity of stars. So under that almost absolutely permanent light of the stars, which exist for hundreds of millions of years, the very short lives of people become very obvious, painfully obvious to the individual. And that's why she says, where you found you were human, and a landscape in which you know you are mortal. We live exceedingly short, brief lives compared to that of a star. There's a double inference here, though. A landscape in which you know you are mortal. There's a sense of that we are very vulnerable. Unlike the stars, We are very vulnerable. And that is part of the theme of this poem, how human life can be lost in an instant, unlike a star, which requires gargantuan forces to destroy it. A human life, or even millions of human lives, can be easily lost very quickly through indifference, through cruelty, anger, but mostly indifference. Indifference to the quality of human life. And a time to choose between them. I have chosen. So, a landscape in which you know you are mortal, and a time to choose between them. So, she's referring here to the human perspective. Do we act as stars? Do we look upon the past and the suffering of those marginalized outsiders as being something objective, stark, unemotional, cold, far removed from us? Or do we choose to be human and to invite the anguish and the sorrow and the pain of remembering them in a human way? So there's a duality here. She is saying we have to make a choice between. We cannot be like the stars, even though the memory of those people and their forgotten pain is like the stars as well. It can be quite confusing how she uses perspective in this poem. But we have to make a choice, and that's what she's referring to, a time to choose between them. I have chosen. The significance of this line is that she is almost confronting the reader. Well, I've made my choice. I will remember them. I will not be distant and cold. I will remember and lament the forgotten, the marginalized. Out of knit in history, I move to be part of that ordeal. So rather than just view it as a cold, or even, you could say, politically emotional remembrance, which is often the case. For example, the famine is often remembered in a very political manner, where she's trying to move beyond the politics of it and trying to remember the human cost, the very human condition of the suffering during the famine. So she's moving away from these very set, mythological, kind of compartmentalized versions of history, which seem to have very political overtones, and she's moving just to a very human reference point. She moves to be part of that ordeal. So she takes on the suffering and the sorrow and the pain of it because she wants to understand it in order to remember it correctly and appropriately. I move to be part of that ordeal whose darkness is only now reaching me from those fields, those rivers, those roads clotted as firmaments with the dead. So she's referring here to whose darkness is only now reaching me. So as she's grown up and educated herself and considered and delved into and researched, in this case, the pain and sorrow of the past in many different instances where people suffered needlessly or cruelly, and that pain and that suffering, that emotional impact is only now reaching her at this point in time in her life because she has both read about it, learned about it, but she has invited the emotional impact upon herself. And it's reaching her from those fields, those rivers, and those roads, clotted as firmaments with the dead. So the pain of suffering that people experienced is now reaching her from the fields, the rivers, and the roads. So the firmaments, clotted as firmaments with the dead. So the bodies strewn everywhere. Like the stars in the night sky, all these dead bodies thrown everywhere, as it was in many parts of Ireland during the Great Famine. People died on the road, men, women, and children. They died in the fields. They died unattended. And this is the real key point of the poem. In many ways, as she says in the final stanza, how slowly they die. again emphasizing a very uncomfortable and disturbing image of people dying very slowly, how slowly they die as we kneel beside them, whisper in their ear, and we are late, we are always too late. Now, this comes back to, particularly during the famine, over 1 million people died in Ireland. That is statistically proven. Over 1 million, some figures say as high as 1.6 million, men, women, and children, and they died everywhere. They died in their homes, just outside their homes, working on these famine roads, working in the field. They died in the fields, they died in ditches, and the key commonality was, in many cases, they all died alone. And there was no one there to comfort them at the end. And that really is the powerful emotional impact of this poem. And she really addresses it, almost painfully addresses it in the final stanza. As you can see in the note there, where I said Boland, accessing the true experience of the people of the past, she literally, symbolically kneels beside them as you would beside a dying person, referring to an act of contrition, which is, it's said usually by a priest just before someone passes away. And it conveys to the reader how much Boland wants to be involved in their suffering and to remember their suffering. She is willing to go through that experience of being there with them as they die. And the last line, and we are late, we're always too late. Even though she's honouring them, even though she's drawing attention to it, she herself, despite her best efforts, is too late. The poor people who suffered and died in this way do not know that the poet has remembered them. So in her own poetic position, and her position of lamenting and remembering people as a writer, she has failed to reach them at some level, because they are not aware, obviously, that a poet over 140 years later wrote a very moving poem about them collectively. And of course, what that leads us to assume is what Bolands is truly saying through this poem, that we dismiss the emotional and visceral human impact of suffering too easily. On the one hand, you have groups who dismiss it, bury it, and deny it. On the other hand, if you look at the classic Anglo-Irish conflict, the British would dismiss it, bury it, deny it, distance themselves from it, but the Irish would politicise it and create a kind of gargantuan myth around it, while not really focusing on the individual human condition of suffering. So she's trying to move between both of these constructs, and she's trying to inhabit what is the most important thing, the suffering of the human condition in such an extreme ordeal. So I hope that helps in some way, and I've used a microphone this time. Let me know if it's better or worse, and let me know if you have any more questions about this particular poem.